Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our broadcast live from the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. I'm Jennifer Stokes, Managing Director of Development for the Rocky Mountain Institute, and I'm joined by my colleagues John Creyts and Richenda van Leeuwen for our conversation today. It's a pivotal time at Rocky Mountain Institute, and we recently kicked off the 1.5 degree challenge to help raise money as we come into the end of the year to kick us off into 2020. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today and for being part of the solutions for our clean energy future. We've got a wide audience. We had more than 800 people register to join us from all across the globe, so thank you very much for being here. And whether you're listening right now live or you're listening to the recording afterwards, we're so glad you can join us and you're part of the solution. We have members from our donor and our giving community, our Innovators Circle, our National Solutions Council, our Legacy Society members. Thank you for all that you do to make our work possible every day and for allowing us to be here to share what's been happening at Rocky Mountain Institute and what our leaders are thinking about as we head into the next year. And so today we're talking about what Hope Applied really looks like. In a time that's urgent for our climate, where we know that people are seeking solutions to keep us on what seems an ever more daunting task to stay on a path to a 1.5 degree temperature rise future, what we're focused on is a conversation today that will be grounded in the climate science that tells us that what we know now is that we need to stay and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 50% in the next 10 years to stay on this path to a 1.5 degree temperature rise. And that window is closing quickly. And so as we think about this in our work every day, John and Richenda, how is RMI responding to this? John, you've been at RMI for a long time. What do you think about this new urgency?
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm delighted to be here today, and I have to say, it's clear to us all at Rocky Mountain Institute we're not on track, and I think that is driving an increased impatience, a desire to move more quickly, to use all the resources that we have to help support the world in addressing this challenge. When we think about where we are right now, we have not yet bent the curve in terms of overall emissions. Last year, we produced yet more emissions than we had the prior year, and that's a big challenge. We see that CO2 is accumulating in the atmosphere, and the trend is going upward, unbent here. And when we look at the physical implications, we also see quite clearly that evidence is out there that suggests we have to act more urgently. This July was the hottest July on record. Greenland, for instance, lost more ice in one day, or lost enough ice in one day to cover the entire state of Florida in 2.5 inches of water. So when we think about that, that's the type of pace of change that the environment is going through, and we have to respond to that. At RMI, as we've recognized the need to lead and the need to support in the energy transition faster, and I would say, energy is at the crux of this. It's 70% of the problem overall, right? We recognize kind of a need to take our tools and do more with them faster. And so one of the things that we've done is used kind of our best thinking here globally and compiled what we call the 7 challenges. And we convened a global set of actors, of CEOs, of senior level leaders and politicians in the government, of fellow NGO leaders here in November in a rotating meeting that started in Delhi and then went to New York and then went to Beijing, and video linked each of these different leadership groups to struggle with 7 challenges. And those challenges are important ones that RMI has been wrestling with, but we've reframed to help stimulate a global dialogue among this cross-sectoral, society kind of representation. And they include things like, 1, how do we make carbon emissions visible and in real time? Most of the data we deal with now is 4 or 5 years in arrears, and we're trying to drive a change in the global economy based on data that's old. We don't need to settle for that anymore. So how do we understand and make emissions visible so that we can react to them in real time? Secondly, how do we improve the overall energy efficiency and energy productivity of the world to move 3 times faster than it has historically? Third, there's a question around how do we use beneficial electrification and the combination of clean renewables alongside electrifying many of our buildings and industrial processes and mobility to benefit more rapidly from that overall transition. Fourth, we think about urbanization as a key trend that needs to be altered so that we have development that is aligned and capital infrastructure over time that is clean and puts people where they need to be and minimizes the overall energy infrastructure requirements. Fifth, there's a real need for technology development. And we see, some of the strongest stories and evidence of proof of the transition happening quickly today are around things like wind and solar and LEDs and now storage moving very quickly. We need to add many more different technologies onto that list. The sixth thing that we're really worried about and thinking about is, in particular, hard to abate sectors and the steel sector, the cement sector, the chemicals industries. How do we remake the processes there to become far less energy intensive and to use renewables where possible? And the seventh thing is really on how do we ensure a just transition in the end and use and reform our capital and financing structures and our institutions to be inclusive and ultimately to allow this transition to benefit everyone every step along the way. So these are the 7 big challenges. We framed it up in a report here that we use to facilitate this overall dialogue. And it's been a powerful start to engaging at a much broader scale on how we as a society rise to the immediate challenge that we have in this critical decade of responding to the climate crisis.
And so, Richenda, thank you very much. And this report is available on our website if you want to dig deeper into it, and it'll be a lot of the basis of our conversation today. Richenda, you've been working in international development for a long time. With these challenges, do you see them as relevant everywhere in the world?
Absolutely. These are issues that countries like the USA are grappling with, but they're also issues that countries like Ethiopia and Nigeria are grappling with. Many of those countries that I work in across sub-Saharan Africa and other developing countries around the world struggle not only with how to bring in more clean energy into their energy mix, but they're also struggling with how do we even provide electricity to our entire populations. And one of the things that I've seen is that there's been a lot of progress on electrification. In 2010, we had 1.2 billion people around the world. That was almost 1 in 6 people who had no electricity at all in their homes and communities. Today, we're down to 840 million. However, 600 million people live in sub-Saharan Africa today without access to electricity. What that means is they go to try and get healthcare, and you can't deliver modern healthcare services without access to electricity. You don't have the best income opportunities. So these are communities that are also really highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. The good news is that we have these solutions now that John already mentioned, outlined in the 7 Challenges report, like renewable energy solutions, which are extremely applicable, and now they're economic and affordable for us to use as the front line for bringing energy into these countries and giving them an opportunity to follow a different path as they look at how do we industrialize in Ethiopia with a high economic growth rate. We give them the opportunity, and they have the opportunity, to really look at a broader array of solutions than following the fossil fuel dominant path that we did in the US and Europe and elsewhere in terms of helping to look at how we build economic growth. So we've seen a lot of great examples of countries that are now embracing a clean energy future because they could become the big emitters of next century. You know, even before then, countries with like Nigeria, with very high population, with very high urban densification, We want them to be able to use that full suite of solutions, whether it's clean energy, whether it's electric mobility, as part of their planning for a full ecosystem of sustainable supports for them in their future. So it's really a something for everybody, not only in terms of pushing solutions out to the rest of the world, but it's really actually the innovations that are happening in other parts of the world, some of which we are learning about in different parts of the world to create this global ecosystem that everywhere is providing solutions. So one of the things I want to say, is that we are seeing tremendous opportunity with planning that we've been doing just recently in Malawi, for example, with the government of Malawi, developing an investment pathway for them that shows with a combination of energy efficiency and clean energy, renewable energy solutions, they can meet their own country's energy projections and needs over the next 10 to 20 years without having to build coal-fired power plants. So these are the types of plans that we're working with governments to help them look at what are the pathways available to them and how can they develop sustainably, providing these needed services for their populations, but without having to resort to the polluting fuels that will only raise carbon emissions. So, as we're talking this today, we are also in the middle of COP in Madrid, a climate change conference. And so the thing is that each country has an opportunity to really participate this so that their voice is not only heard at COP, but every day of the year, everywhere around the world.
Well, and you bring up COP, and it's a great point. As we sit here today, many world leaders are in Madrid, human rights, energy, climate leaders are in Madrid, talking about, and having this convening on climate change. What is RMI doing there? We've got a number of our team on the ground, and I understand that we actually did a launch of the America's Pledge report to a standing room only crowd.
Well, and that was really exciting for us to be there, in particular on the America's Pledge report. Not only because Harrison Ford helped present it, but also because the findings of that report were quite staggering, right? It showed essentially that based on about over 3,000 different actors in the United States, below our national level, so companies, universities, states, cities, that the collective action of all of those different entities is adding up to a massive reduction overall in our CO2 emissions. And in fact, when we look at where we would be in 2030, based on all of these different aggregate actions, we see about a 37% reduction against the 2005 baseline that we're measuring against, which is tremendous, right? And if we were to double down and actually have the federal government aligned with that, our analysis also showed that the United States could get almost up to 50%, about 49% reduction overall in our CO2 by 2030 if we were able to re-engage the federal government. I think that is hope, right? That is the idea that many different actors can individually add up to something that is that big of a change is really important and has been, again, an important talking point that's been circulating around the COP here to say that despite the U.S. government's position, this subnational action group is clearly making waves and committed to that overall progress. On the other front, RMI is circulating in many other ways. One effort that we have underway is clearly we work extensively in China, and I help build the China program there. But we've been helping the Chinese government understand ways to advance their overall clean energy ambitions. And in particular, I've been doing a lot of work with them modeling and supporting the grid transition on how they can, using the same assets they have, reduce their overall emissions quite substantially in the process and save a lot of money by redispatching and moving to clean energy dispatch of their grid assets. We've also been working with them on areas like how to create zero carbon districts and have a massive district south of Shanghai in a city called Ningbo. That is a new city of about 500,000 where we're building a near zero carbon zone that is expressly designed so that all the infrastructure, all of the mobility requirements within that city produce zero carbon for a city that large. So these are examples that are circulating and being used and talked about at the COP this week. But there are other examples as well, and in particular in finance. Richenda, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. We are also very much involved in climate finance, and one of the things that in my world, and as a former investor, you actually need to get transactions done, because energy and changing the way that we transact energy through markets really is a big part of the solution for bringing our emissions down. And we see that although there's a lot of work going on to address financial flows, we're still seeing that there's more work to be done, particularly again, although we have international networks like the Green Climate Fund, there's still work to be done to make sure that every country has access to that climate finance, that they have the tools that they need to be able to know. We've got green banks that have been developed in New York, but what about green banks in other parts of the world? So RMI is really looking at how we can be influencing and developing partnerships to look at how we have sort of global templates for what it means to set up a green bank. Or we're also working on the global finance, climate finance access network, again to look at, does every country have the tools that it needs to be able to access the resources that are available, and are those resources available? So how do we source all the finance that's needed to make transactions happen? Because ultimately it is about changing the types of commercial deals that are happening, and also the types of capital that are coming into the sector. You know, there are huge financial flows every day, but how many of them are really climate aligned, and how many of them are really aligned to a 1.5 degree scenario? And that's the type of work that we're doing, and we've got a great team there at COP right now who are building out those partnerships to make it happen.
And so this climate aligned financial sector is a phrase that's coming up a lot more and more at RMI. And what's been happening with the Poseidon Principles over the last year, I think, was a real pivot point for us in thinking about how do we influence these financial sectors. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, the Poseidon Principles is a really exciting template that I think we can look at when we think about climate-aligned finance. You know, we worked with a number of the chief financiers of the shipping industry globally and laid out a pathway to decarbonization and how to think about managing capital investments relative to an increasingly clean fleet of global freight ships. And we had some of the most prominent banks in the world sign up to and agree to embrace these principles and use them in deploying capital going forward. Now, that's important when we talk about shipping being more than 1% of global emissions. But it's even more important when we think about how that same template for how to engage the major financial institutions and banks can be used to set templates around other heavy infrastructure, right? Whether it be for how we finance steel plants all the way through to how we think about financing the electric power sector, right? And there's an emerging ability for us to translate these approaches that are inclusive alongside some of the technical rigor and the financial modeling to help us ultimately build the new capital system that's going to be required for a flourishing, clean, and sustainable energy system.
Great. Well, and with more than 90% of all the goods that we have going on ships, at least we're going to get them to ourselves.
It touches supply chain, touches everyone, and it is something that we can materially shift immediately.
So let's talk about this scaling pivot for RMI. And as we think about, we've got a tremendous track record in innovation and really thinking about systems, looking much more broadly and in a whole systems approach. But now is the time for scale. We don't have a lot of time. Mm-hmm. And so what are the innovations that you're seeing coming out of RMI, but also globally, that really give you hope for the future?
Well, let me jump in on this, and maybe then I'll turn over to you, Richenda, to offer a few thoughts. But let me start with building electrification, right? RMI for 38 years, we've been working on efficiency and renewables, right? And when you combine those two things together and you recognize that we're making great progress on moving toward renewables on the grid, you recognize that we can start designing systems that where it is cheaper to electrify and it's better for the environment to electrify. And so we've been working specifically on how do we parlay that economic gain to environmental gains here through combining the trends of clean and efficient energy alongside driving down the costs for electrification and providing appliances and systems that actually can benefit from that cleanliness and make an economic case to move forward. And so we've been very focused on scaling and thinking about here in the United States in particular as a starting point, although we have some leadership in the UK as well to draw upon. How do we ultimately enact and mobilize and capture that economic value? We started with California and a number of cities over there. In particular, worked first with Berkeley, where we were invited in to help them think about how to transition to a electrification requirement for all new buildings and pulling gas lines out of any new construction. And interestingly enough, the local utility came in on our side and said, despite the fact that they had a gas interest, they said, we recognize electrification is the future, and helped support ultimately passing the first ordinance in the state of California for a electrified building requirement for all new build here coming up in 2025. That was a first step, but since then, major cities throughout California and adding some nationally and now increasingly, as I mentioned, UK and elsewhere, globally, we're starting to see a trend toward using electrification and beneficial electrification as a theme as being an important area of infrastructure changeover that makes economic sense and pulls the gas out of the system here, because in the end, gas is a pollutant that is going to cause the same types of problems that coal has historically for us when it comes to CO2 pollution. So that's kind of one example from an infrastructure perspective. That's a slower change. Anytime we talk about infrastructure, we think, we've got to move methodically, but when cities can make statements and change regulations, we can make big jumps along the way. We're also thinking, though, about disruptive change and how exactly do we use data and information in new ways and leverage this massive information technology capability here to help us smarten systems and reduce energy use immediately. And we have many different exciting areas that we're doing that in, but one that I'd like to highlight is one of our market affiliates, a company called WattTime. And it really uses artificial intelligence to say whether it's beneficial to change your production or change your behavior in any way. What's the carbon benefit of that? So if I'm charging my electric vehicle, is it better to charge it now or later at night? And they have algorithms to do that. Or if I'm a big data center operator, does it make sense for me to process data up in Washington State or over in Virginia, right? And be able to show them the benefits in real time so that you can make decisions, right?
That's a lot of transparency.
It's a lot of transparency, and it allows real concrete business decisions to be made immediately. And interestingly, others have recognized the power of this algorithm and the fact that we can use it in much more sophisticated ways to get much further faster. And so we've now partnered in WattTime with Google.org. They're working with us specifically to help use those algorithms that we have to train satellite data to help us understand in real time what the carbon emissions are in the grid all over the world, right? Which is a massive, massive leap forward and gives us the ability to act, again, with the same degree of transparency around what business decisions can and should be made differently based on the combination of environmental and economic benefits that can be weighed side by side. So very exciting. There are lots of other things that we're doing in blockchain space with the Energy Web Foundation and in the innovation space, but there are we are very keen to find ways to disrupt and move forward and allow smart decisions to be made much more quickly through, again, taking advantage of this massive and emerging information technology capability.
That's amazing. And what does that look like in your world, Richenda?
So, I mean, John's outlined some areas where we're working, but we are global.
Right.
And not all innovations are sourced from the US. And we are doing a lot of work right now with the Global Calling Prize with the government of India to really focus on, we recognize in a warming world we need more efficient solutions, and appliances are certainly a part of that. And so we've been focusing on something called the Global Cooling Prize, and it's been really exciting just to really see how we can help to accelerate innovation, and so bringing in far more energy efficient air conditioners onto the market more quickly, innovations around model design that haven't been used previously. And we've taken the competition now to a group of 8 finalists sourced from many different places, different companies, some of them already doing this work, some of them coming in to really look at how we can change this global cooling market more quickly. So yes, it's work with India, but it's also work that has relevance around the world. So one of the things I really want to highlight is that innovations can be sourced from everywhere. And we're also working right now in Nigeria, and we're just beginning to work on another issue, which is really a health issue as well as a climate issue, which is working on cooking solutions to address the 4 million people per year, and it's mostly women and children who die prematurely because of cooking particulates, which are also short-lived climate pollutants. So they're also having a climate effect, but there's also a health effect as well. So we are beginning to put electric appliances now on some of the microgrid work that we're doing already in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, and about to scale to 12 other countries with the UN Development Programme and the African Development Bank to really look at how can we bring renewable energy solutions, but also look at where there's effects on health, for women and children particularly, but how do these choices around what appliances that you're using, are they available on the market for you, are they affordable to you, how we can be really looking at that market transformation that is inclusive for everybody. So that's work we're doing in Africa. In the Caribbean, we're also working very much on how to build resilient energy systems. So we've been focused on a lot of initial commercial transactions around solar and storage in particular, to bring in on the grid. But because the Caribbean is also particularly vulnerable to the effects of hurricanes, which are growing more intense, we're also looking at what are the lessons learned in building resilient infrastructure. We had a great report that was heavily downloaded called Solar Under Storm. Mm-hmm. We are working now on the second version of that report that is really going to be focusing on rooftop solar and how do we make that resilient when we're looking at Cat 5 plus hurricanes. We saw what happened recently in the Bahamas with Hurricane Dorian. We are trying to get those lessons not only for the Caribbean, but they're relevant anywhere that you have a hurricane, a typhoon, a cyclone, which are all the same thing, but in different parts of the world. Right. Any kind of natural disaster that we're looking at. So how can we scale those solutions? And we're looking at in the mobility sector as well. We've just developed a new mobility lab in Bangalore in India, and we're looking at some of these questions around holistic transportation systems. Yes, it's about electric vehicles, but it goes beyond electric vehicles as well. How do they function? How do we get them into the market? How do we get them adopted? What's the kind of national and subnational policy that you need to create those markets and move them more quickly? Because urgency is of the essence right now. So, we're really focusing on the applied hope, but it's also about how do we realize that hope?
That's right. Well, in building on those lab structures in Pune and then in Delhi, the Bangalore one will be, I think, a little bit maybe in February of this coming year. It's very, very exciting. One question I wanted to dig into a little bit is around when you talk about efficient appliances in communities that don't have electricity. As you are electrifying with clean electricity, why is efficiency in the appliances also important?
So one of the things is, first of all, we've seen some innovations that have really been, I hate to use the word game changer, but game changers in developing countries. One of them was the development of the LED light, which is not only efficient, but it actually means for when you're in a community that only has certain level of ability to pay for a solution, you are decreasing the cost of the overall system, if it's a solar home system or a mini grid, to be able to provide that same level of light quality. So the efficiency is huge because it's a cost driver, and that actually helps tremendously with the affordability for families who wouldn't otherwise necessarily be able to get that solution. So we've seen this sea change in LEDs, we're seeing it now in storage, and the cheaper, the lower cost that battery storage becomes, it becomes much more accessible for people who don't have access to the national grid. So these kinds of innovations, whether it's on the efficiency side, but it's also the availability side, and it's also how do you finance those solutions? Do you have to pay for it all up front? Can you pay for it in increments, something we call pay as you go? How do we have these financial solutions to be able to ensure that everybody has that access that they need?
Great, thank you. So we did ask all of you for a few questions, and so I wanted to share some of those as we still have a little bit of time. So one question that's come up from a number of our donors is, what do we see the role of carbon capture and sequestration, and how is RMI assessing that opportunity?
Yeah, why don't I jump in on this one here, Jennifer? I think carbon capture and storage is an important technology, right? When we think about it, there is a very large coal fleet out there that is likely to be stranded in different parts of the world, and we need to have ways to address that. The question on carbon capture and storage is always whether it's economic in the end and whether it competes against the alternatives. And we see the cost declines on renewables being so steep that it is challenging, increasingly challenging, to see how that technology becomes cost competitive over time. But we at RMI think we need to look at it and monitor it and understand it and kind of move forward with that and apply the right economic tool, the right carbon mitigation tool in the respective environment, right? However, I think there's another permutation on carbon capture and storage on direct air capture, right? So actually pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it in the ground. The most obvious natural, kind of representation of that is a tree or anything biological that does that, algae, et cetera. But we can do that mechanically as well. And we at RMI have been thinking about what's the important role that could play. It's certainly costly right now as it stands, but we're in a situation where we need to act with recognition that we're in a global crisis. And so we are actively monitoring and understanding and thinking about the availability and implications of those technologies. Regardless, though, we would see that as one of many measures that need to be implemented. It is not by any stretch a type of silver bullet that we should be waiting for. There are elements that we need to be pursuing vigilantly around energy efficiency and energy productivity, around renewables and electrification, as I mentioned, all along with those 7 challenges at the beginning, that waiting for a direct air capture solution just cannot delay.
Yeah, I would just add, that we have so many tools in our toolkit. We can't be complacent. This is a climate crisis. We need to act with the urgency of now and today. We have things like renewable energy. The economics have shifted so fundamentally that renewable energy, clean energy solutions are now more affordable in most parts of the world, in most cases, than fossil solutions. So we need to really use and just build out and drive out those solutions that we have already today, while we also work on the economics of those that have a role to play, hopefully tomorrow. We do see, over time, the economic shift, but we also can't be complacent and not use every tool that we have in our toolkit today, because it's just too important.
And there's no one single solution, right? It's the entire complement's got to come together.
That's absolutely right.
So another question that we had is, how are you planning to seek and use the ideas of all people affected by climate change in shaping your strategy and in your work?
So I'd love to take this one on, because I think it's really great that RMI, having started out of Colorado, is now a global organization. We have offices in Beijing, we have a sister organization that's based in New Delhi in India. I'm personally involved in the process of establishing our office in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia as an anchor for our ongoing work in sub-Saharan Africa. We also have obviously a very strong US presence. We are really globalizing because we recognize that these are global issues. We don't want anybody's voice not to be included as part of that solution set. These are too important for us to not focus on work across the globe and with every demographic. You know, we work on solutions. As a woman, you know, I'm really focused also on gender and energy and gender and climate change and how we make sure that everybody's voice can contribute in looking at and applying these solutions. Again, because we don't have time to not really look at all voices. I've been thrilled by the youth activism over the last year, 2 years particularly, and just seeing some of the young climate leaders like Greta Thunberg and many others around the world who are really challenging us to go more quickly, because I think we need to do that. Their voice is just critical in this because it is the world that we are leaving behind to the young people.
And how are we staffing up those offices internationally? What does that look like for us?
It looks like the world. So people from different cultures, different backgrounds, and we're really looking to make sure that RMI is engaging globally, that we are focused on being that global culture.
Great. And so this is our year-end fundraising season. A huge portion of the money that we raise for the Institute comes in the month of December. And so as we talk about Hope Applied and we're in the middle of raising money, what are you most excited to be using this money to do in the next year?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in.
Let's go with Richenda first.
Okay.
So I have two areas really particularly. One is the regional mini-grid program I mentioned earlier, which we are hoping will be funded by the Global Environment Facility we are hearing next week. That is anchor funding, however, we still need wraparound funding. As I mentioned, RMI looks at whole systems transformation. So even if we're coming in really looking at microgrids with the government, that government may then ask us to look at efficiency measures. It may ask us to look at mobility. It may ask us to look at clean cooking solutions. So we need to be able to have those resources in place so we don't have to turn down those opportunities, because we are coming as a whole energy systems organization. That's the way we work on these problems. So that's one area particularly. And then very specifically, we've got a team right now as we speak down in the Bahamas, focusing with the government of the Bahamas on the rebuild after Hurricane Dorian. We do not yet have that fully funded. We've got a lot of work. We were already working on some of the renewable energy power projects with the government before Hurricane Dorian happened. What we've had to do is shift the timing of some of those projects to bring them up now so that we can work in Abaco, we can work in Grand Bahama to make sure that people have those resilient power systems that they need, not only for their daily lives, but also in the Caribbean's contribution to working towards a clean energy transition. So we do need additional support there to really make that happen.
Great.
And it's too important for us not to do it.
And we've got to be ready for hurricane season.
Absolutely.
The months are counting down. How about you?
You know, I would again turn to international and think a little bit about our work, in particular in China and India, where we have really tremendous access at the top levels of government in audiences that are looking for our advice and support. And it is a true blessing to be able to offer advice and guidance at that level. But we need to be independent in our positioning there and having the flexibility to draw in others and pull it and form, you know, kind of local partnerships and work to counsel in the right ways on issues of the grid transition in China, on issues of large-scale electrification at the city and regional level in China, on issues of similar electrification and mobility in India. These are areas where, you know, frankly, the dollars that our donors give to us freely and openly help us to do amazing things with the most rapidly emerging and dynamic economies in the world that are adopting at a pace and scale that really helps provide that glimmer, not just a glimmer, but the strong beam of hope for us all to look at. You know, we've been very active in Shenzhen, for instance, in China, which is a remarkable city that is engaged in tremendous electrification. And over the course of a 3 or 4 year period, they electrified their entire bus fleet, then their entire taxi fleet, and we just worked with them to help electrify their entire urban delivery fleet. Taking all that information and data, and we have literally 10,000 trucks that we have instrumented in Shenzhen to help think about how do you design a grid to support that degree of complexity. Being able to take the insights from Shenzhen over to New Delhi and be able to apply it in a city that is really choking on the fumes of diesel exhaust right now is something that we need support to be able to do. And we thank everyone who gives to RMI historically and going forward. It is really an honor to be able to work together in partnership here to deliver global change.
Well, and that is why we are here today. Thank you both so much. I think we have covered a lot of ground. There is obviously more work that RMI is doing globally. We can't get to all of it, but framed by the 7 challenges and just the wonderful examples that you all shared with us today, I think we've got a better idea of what we're working on. And as always, for all of our supporters and partners, we are here in an open conversation with you about the challenges in the energy transformation. Many of you are working on this every day yourselves. And so we want to continue to inspire you as you inspire us at Rocky Mountain Institute. And so we are calling on you to join us. We do have our 1.5 degree challenge. We have a number of donors that came in order to make commitments to match all new and increased gifts giving before the end of the year to Rocky Mountain Institute. And so if you are giving a gift that is new or increased under $5,000, our challenge donors will match you 50%. If you make a gift under $10,000, and if you make a gift of $10,000, that will be matched 150%. So we have that challenge match up to $100,000. We know donors are already giving right now, but we hope that you will join us. You will continue to make this work possible. And thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for coming to the National Press Club in DC for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.